Welcome back. Well, the United States appears to have taken a bit of a bashing over its image. But what of other countries? In the 5 European countries taking part in the poll we're discussing, 19% of people saw China as the biggest threat to world security, up from 12% at this time last year. 17% saw Iran as the biggest risk. 11% perceived the greatest danger from Iraq. Within the United States itself, a quarter of people saw North Korea as the biggest threat. 23% opted for Iran, and 1 in 5 were most afraid of China. Well, we're still joined by our guests in London, Jeremy Corbyn, a Labour Member of Parliament; in Washington, Ariel Cohen, a Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation; and Amr Hamzawi, also in Washington, a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Amr Hamzawi, if I can go to you first in the second half of this show. What about this so-called axis of evil? North Korea, Iran, Iraq, they feature prominently and high up on the list when people were polled. Why do you think so?
Well, out of two reasons. Primarily, lack of democratic institutions and dynamics inside these countries, and two, especially with regard to China and Iran. These are two countries with aggressive foreign policies, two countries, be it China or Iran, which have close ties to autocratic regimes, to anti-Western regimes across the world, and especially in the case of Iran, a country which is, as of now, represents the greatest threat to Western, primarily American interests in the Middle East. So I would imagine that we really have a domestic component, which is lack of democracy, and an international component with regard to foreign policies of China, Iran, and the likes.
Ariel Cohen, is the China threat a fabrication, or is there something there?
Well, first of all, I'm kind of amused that Amr Hamzawi does not mention the Iranian threat to the Sunni moderate regimes of the Middle East, to the Gulf regimes, and eventually to Saudi Arabia. Amr, if Iran pushes, it's not going to push against the United States. It's going to attack Israel, or it's attacking Israel through the proxy Hezbollah, and it's funding Hamas. And it's Iran's president articulated the most blood-chilling threat to the Jewish state by saying he's going to wipe it off the map.
Okay, let's give Amr Hamzawi a chance quickly to respond to that before you carry on. What about this so-called Shia crescent and this Iranian threat?
Well, if you take popular opinion attitudes in the Gulf seriously, it is quite a mixed picture which you get. The perception of Iran as representing a threat is not shared by great constituencies in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the UAE. You might find some in Saudi Arabia, you might find some in Kuwait, but it's quite a mixed picture. Two, and this is really a crucial factor, what my colleague just did was basically to impose American threat perceptions on Arabs. This is not the case, and I guess this is a lesson which the US badly needs to learn. We do not share American threat perception. We do not share the same threat perception with regard to Iran. We have a different perception with regard to what's happening in Iraq. And we definitely have a different perception with regard to how to fit Israel into the picture of threats, imminent threats in the region, taking into consideration Israeli policies in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Lebanon over last summer.
Ariel Cohen?
I think this is, again, a demonstration of how the United States does not explain its concerns and its threat perception. Part of the public diplomacy effort is to explain what your concerns are. I think this is what President Bush just did with President Putin. Back to your question about China. I think the Chinese economic expansion makes a lot of Europeans insecure. Don't forget, Europe has high unemployment rate, and it's economically losing jobs, just like the United States is losing jobs to the emerging markets, to China in particular. And this economic insecurity translates to the threat perception. And in terms of what Amr Hamzawi said before, that Iran or North Korea are not democratic, Saudi Arabia is not democratic. The Europeans do not perceive the kingdom as a potential threat to Europe.
Jeremy Corbyn, there's been talk now of China and the so-called economic threat. Is all the resentment that people have about foreign policy only, or can we put in economics and cultural domination playing a part as well?
I don't think people are particularly hostile to China. I think they're uncomprehending to some extent and nervous in other ways. China is growing very, very fast economically. It has huge problems of human rights within China. It has huge environmental problems. Whether there's going to be some long-term conflict between China and the US at an economic level, possibly, because China is going to become the world's richest country within the next 10, 20 years, I should imagine, but also it has such a huge influence internationally in its participation in the US debt, its dollar holdings, its gold reserves, and all the other things. So China is a huge and very important factor. But I do think the relationship and attitude towards China is wholly different towards the relationship, for example, North Korea or Iran. Now, let's take the case of Iran. The US gives this incredible level of economic and military support to Israel all the time, which has over 200 nuclear warheads and the capability of delivering them. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm pleased. It has not left the NPT, and at last there seems to be a small degree of engagement between the US and Iran, and I don't think this sort of endless bellicose attack on Iran actually does much good. Now, I'm not here to defend the human rights record of the Iranian regime. I am asking people to recognize that there are widespread diverging opinions in Iran, and there is no one power center there.
Ahmadinejad.
No, I'm not defending Ahmadinejad. What I'm saying is that the US and the West should engage with Iran, keep them in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and stop upping the ante all the time of saying they're about to attack Iran. Now, there are some signs that has changed. The US actually met Iran at, in the discussions about the future of Iraq. That surely has got to be a recognition that there can be no military solution to the problems
Jeremy Corbyn,
within the region.
you mentioned Iran, and you mentioned also the US support for Israel. Some say blind support for Israel. Ahmad Hamzawi, would you agree that if the US changed its approach with dealing with Israel, it will change a lot of the public opinion?
In the Middle East, definitely, in the sense of imagining that the US policies toward Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, be it with regard to the Palestinian, the Lebanese component or the Syrian component, would become more balanced, not anti-Israeli national interests and security interests, but more balanced in the sense of taking the Arab side seriously. Yes, it will definitely impact positively on popular opinion attitudes. But let me go back to why Iran and why North Korea and China. And besides the economic factor which was mentioned, I do believe that the lack of democratic institutions and mechanisms inside these countries impacts clearly on European popular opinion attitudes. And with regard to Saudi Arabia is mentioned. It comes up at least in Spain, which once again proves the fact that Europeans and average Americans, when they look abroad, they would like to see countries ruled and managed democratically and not autocratically. Of course, when these countries tend to take foreign policy positions that are anti-Western, anti-American, the perception of their threat or their danger becomes eminent and more.
Ariel Cohen, I'd like to ask you, if you could bear with me, I'd like to ask you, looking forward, Bush is going to have a successor next year. Come the end of 2008, George Bush is not going to be in charge of the United States. What sort of job does George Bush's successor have on his hands?
Well, first of all, I want to answer to Ammar that you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Either we are going to base our foreign policy on democratic promotion, which I think is a mistake, or we're not going to factor in how foreign countries are ruled
but if we can look forward for a second, how can the U.S. change its image? Very quickly, sir.
The United States, first of all, has to formulate its policy and clearly rebuild its apparatus to explain it. What we're doing today is so much weaker than what we did during the Cold War. We need to hire Arabic speakers. We need to hire diplomats who are fluent in the languages of the countries.
All right, Ariel Cohen, I'm going to stop you there. Jeremy Corbyn, very quickly to wrap up, what does the U.S. need to do to change its image? Very quickly, sir.
Get out of Iraq, start supporting international law and international institutions, and stop the idea that it can intervene anywhere it likes, any time, because that is what makes the world a much more dangerous place.
Ahmad Hamzawi, yes or no? Can they change the tide and get the world back in support of them and their foreign policy? Yes or no?
They can if they manage to get out more balanced foreign policies. It's not an image problem. Look at Al-Hurra and Sawa. They have plenty of Arabic speakers.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there.
There is no reason in defending the image.
Thank you very much for your opinions. We seem to have run out of time for this edition of Inside Story. And thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.